All right, guys, we're back here. Part two of this note series on World War II. This one's going to go a lot quicker. We've got half the slides to get through, and I'm sure Mr. Hanson and I are going to try to speed this one up just a little bit for you after the first one was a little bit longer. So we're going to look at the other half of the war for us, which is the war in the Pacific. And if you remember back to the very beginning of the first set of notes we did, we had to make a decision which side we were going to try to put all our full force against to start off with. The decision was made to go after Germany first, but that does not mean that we just left Japan completely alone. That wasn't an option because they were going to continue to come after us. And so we were fighting a war against the Japanese the entire time that we were fighting the war in Europe as well. We just weren't putting everything into it that we had necessarily. And so we're going to rewind a little bit, and you're going to notice the dates are going to be, farther back than some of the ones that we just saw in the previous set of notes. The war in the Pacific was a different war because it was, instead of being a more heavily land-based war, there was a lot of naval battles, battles on small islands. We mentioned D-Day. In the other set of notes, it's basically D-Day over and over and over again, which you're going to see why here in a second. So just a quick timeline, sort of a little review of some of the things that we've seen before here. December 1941, you have Pearl Harbor, which effectively is the beginning of the war for us. Okay, and then May of 1942, the Philippines fall. You have what's called the Bataan Death March. The Japanese were basically the aggressor for a lot of the first year or two of the war, and we took a lot of losses early on. So eventually I guess I'll go back here and talk about this Bataan Death March a little bit real quick, just because it kind of shows the United States very early on what the war is going to be like against the Japanese. They march our guys. We had to surrender. Quite a few troops were captured, and they marched our guys all the way across the island. And every time one of our guys couldn't keep up from exhaustion or whatever, they pulled them off to the side, and they would, most of the time, either shoot them execution style or they'd behead them right in front of their buddies. And we've learned very quickly that this was going to be all out total war, and it was going to get pretty barbaric. So we eventually adopt what we called the island hopping strategy. To get to the mainland of Japan, we were going to capture all these little islands along the way and just set up a new staging area for the next invasion, and so on and so forth until we got all the way across the Pacific Ocean. April 1942, you have Doolittle's raid on Tokyo, where we actually bomb Tokyo, Japan. But it wasn't a strategically important event. It was more of a morale thing to show that we could carry out something against the Japanese, because a lot of Americans after Pearl Harbor and the Philippines thought, the Japanese couldn't be beaten, that they were invincible because they hadn't lost a battle. And so we shattered that idea with Doolittle's raid, and then we started to do the grind, the heavy work of moving all the way across the Pacific Ocean to hopefully eventually get close enough to where we could invade Japan. Let Mr. Ansman take course C.
One of the first major battles, again, this is a completely different war, as Mr. Denton said, than what we were fighting in Europe. This is not a let's roll the tanks out, let's dig in trenches. This is going to be a lot of naval and air battles. And one of the first major one of those is going to be the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 42. You've heard us talk about this before, about the difference between a strategic victory and a tactical victory. Sometimes you might lose more people or give up a little bit of ground, and it might be considered a tactical victory for the other side, but from a long strategy-wise, it's kind of for your favor, and this is what the Coral Sea was for us. Japan's going to cause more damage, but we're able to replace that. Again, once we got committed and declared war, our country shifted everything into the war effort. So we're going to be able to rebuild things, replace things. Japan is not going to be able to do that. So while they might have caused more damage than we did on them, we were able to replace the stuff that they destroyed where they were not going to be able to do that. And also, it's going to be a little bit of a morale boost for us because we're going to repel this invasion for the first time. So you're going to get a little bit of a morale boost. And again, we're going to destroy some stuff that they cannot replace.
And that's really one of the biggest, most important themes of this whole part of the war is that the Japanese can't afford to take losses, and we can. And so every time we fight a battle, even if we don't outright win that battle completely, we're replacing every ship that we lose, every soldier that dies. We're replacing them with fresh reinforcements, and the Japanese, they can't replace anything. And the Japanese know that. They understand too. And I always kind of make this point that Pearl Harbor was this big, massive victory that went absolutely perfect for the Japanese. But it's also the day they lost World War II because they didn't knock us out of the war. And so from every day moving forward, as we stay in the war and continue on, it becomes more and more inevitable that the Japanese are going to lose. So the Battle of Midway, we talked about turning points. D-Day was kind of seen for us anyways. This is a big turning point in Europe and the Pacific. It's going to be Midway. The Japanese were hoping for another, some kind of knockout punch against us to catch us off guard. And they had bad intel on, bad intelligence on where we were going to be and how much our strength was going to be. And on the flip side of that, we knew it was coming. We broke their code, and we knew exactly what was going to happen. And so we knocked out 4 aircraft carriers. We, took down a bunch of planes with trained pilots. Again, the Japanese, even maintenance men, they could not replace those guys. On the flip side, again, we're continuing to gain strength as we go throughout the war. And so what we didn't know is, even though we knew, hey, if we decide we want to win this war, we're going to win it. But what we didn't know was how much it was going to cost. Because the Japanese, we going back to, I think we talked about this in the previous set of notes, they had that kamikaze mindset. And that was not something that happened just at the end. That was there all throughout the war, that they were not going to give in. They were not going to, even if the odds were literally impossible, they would rather die than go home a loser. And so that's playing a huge role in everything that happens throughout the remainder of the war here. So.
All right. So again, just kind of going back to that strategy of island hopping. There's going to be some significant islands that we're going to capture, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the Marshall Marinette Islands. Again, these are just us going in, gaining control of these islands, and taking away early warning systems for the mainland of Japan. And on the flip side of that, allowing us to have staging areas for that if it comes to that. A lot of these battles early on are going to be unpopulated islands, and they're going to seem insignificant. But again, they serve as those early warning stations and staging areas for us. So they have strategic significance. All along this time, the conditions are going to be completely different than what our guys in Europe were facing. Where we talked earlier about the brutal cold, in the dead of winter for Bastogne. In the Pacific, they're going to deal with a whole different type of environment. These monsoons where it's just going to rain for hours and sometimes days on end. You've got the threat of malaria with the mosquitoes and insects. That's going to cause several casualties. just reading down through the list, the heat, the jungle conditions, and then again, you deal with all of the stuff that you cannot control weather-wise, and then you throw in that kamikaze mentality that the person that you're fighting on the other side is going to die before surrender. So, pretty brutal fighting for our guys in the Pacific. All right, I know Mr. Denton likes to talk about Iwo Jima, so I'm going to turn it over to him here and let him walk you through that.
Okay, so I'm going to do my best to fly through this here. Iwo Jima is kind of like the poster child for this whole war in the Pacific, because it's just a little speck of land. There's nobody. It's uninhabited. Nobody lives there. It's an extinct volcano, but it becomes this location where this intense fight takes place because it's strategically important. Okay, and you can see, even though there's not much to it, it's right off the mainland of Japan, and so that makes it extremely valuable. The Japanese knew we were coming, and so they spent a ton of time. And again, there's no real chance for them to truly hold us off or to win this war in a traditional sense. So their one and only hope is to make it so horrible, so just offensive in terms of the loss of life and brutality and everything else, to make us want to quit and give up. And so they spent a ton of time digging tunnels, caves, bunkers, reinforcing them with concrete and wood and things like that to where it was impenetrable. And we bombed this island relentlessly for weeks. And it did nothing. And they could basically, there were trap doors everywhere. They could go from one side of the island almost to the other without ever going above ground. Like I said, there were trap doors and things of that nature. But this and we knew that they were digging in, but this was a place that was, if we were going to invade Japan, this was going to become an extremely important place. Early warning system for the mainland, and it was also a place where we could stage for an invasion. Okay. Bird's eye view of the island there, you can see again, there's literally nothing there. Okay. But it had become important because of this war. And so you see over here, bottom right-hand corner of that picture, that's Mount Suribachi. And that place became very important, very famous because of a photo that was taken. Now, you guys know that if you know much about military history and stuff like that, one of the key objectives in a battle is always to capture the high ground. Day one, we rolled up onto the beach, and it wasn't like D-Day, where as soon as we got off the boats, the Germans were trying to mow us down and everything else. The Japanese actually led us up onto the beach, tried to draw us in, and then that's when they started popping out of their trap doors and things like that. And they were just trying to kill as many of us as they possibly could. And so just on that first day, though, we made some advances. We captured Mount Suribachi there, and we put a flag up at the top. And I'm not going to go way into detail on this, but this became the most reproduced photograph in history. And most of you guys have seen it before. There's some controversy around, the fact that there were two flags that were put up there and whether or not this photograph was staged and everything else. I will tell you, there's a great book that was written about it. It's called Flags of Our Fathers. They made a movie out of it. The movie's all right. It's not nearly as good as the book. 3 of the guys, by the time this photograph was published, were already dead because the fighting carried on for weeks afterwards. But then the remaining 3 guys were brought home and became national heroes and went around trying to sell war bonds and everything else. They became superstars. And this picture, obviously, you guys have all seen it before, but it became a huge motivator and a morale thing for Americans at a time when, the war was getting close to being over, but everybody was completely tired of the war. They were tired of the loss of life and everything else. And so this picture is an important picture that came along at an important time. again, you see that kamikaze mentality that came out amongst the Japanese, this honor code that they had. And it wasn't about fighting necessarily with honor. It was about their own personal honor and not going home losers, that they would rather go home dead than a loser. Kind of a Spartan type thing taken to the extreme. And you can see that in the numbers there. 25,000 United States casualties, 7,000 killed. And it's important to understand here, too, we were mostly fighting this side of the war completely on our own. There were, the British and Canadians. We had some help from Australians and a couple other smaller factions, but that was basically it. But you look at the Japanese numbers there. Okay, we had 25,000 casualties. Only 7,000 of those were deaths. All right. Japanese, though, of 18,000 people on the island, only 216 were taken prisoner. Okay, that was by design. They didn't want to go home a loser, and so if they knew they were about to be captured, they'd turn themselves into suicide bombers and pull the pins on grenades and blow themselves up and try to take down 3 or 4 more guys before they went down, and so on. But eventually, we win. It becomes an early warning system, or we eliminate that early warning system, I should say, and became an airfield for bombing staging area for that possible invasion of Japan.
All right, next major one here is going to be Okinawa. It's going to last a little bit more than a month, and it will end our island hopping campaign. This is going to be our final staging area for invading the Japanese mainland, providing that we can gain control of it. Fighting is going to be a lot different here. Well, I shouldn't say a lot different, but there's going to be a lot more combat. You got 82 days of battle. Again, looking at the numbers, there are 80,000 Japanese troops to our 20,000. It is going to be a heavy populated island, unlike that of Iwo Jima. So this is where, and again, one of those, we've been talking about the kamikaze mentality. Our guys had to deal with and see a lot of stuff, and you're going to start to hear a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder coming back from World War II. A lot of that can be credited to some of the stuff that they're going to see in the Pacific. You're going to see the Japanese send young kids to the front lines, and our guys are going to be faced with: am I going to let a little kid pull a grenade and blow me up, or am I going to have to kill him? And again, just the brutality of the fighting in the Pacific is going to be a little bit different. I don't want to say it's going to be better or worse than it was in Europe, but it's going to be different. Our guys in the Pacific are going to be seeing stuff that's going to be different than the guys in Europe.
All right. So at this point, there's a lot of questions that start to be asked. And this is right around the time where we haven't mentioned this in the notes, but Franklin Roosevelt he's died at this point close to the beginning of his 4th term. And so Harry Truman now is faced with a really difficult decision, which we'll get to here in a little bit later on. But these 2 victories that we just talked about make our overall victory in this war inevitable. There's no way that the Japanese can withstand us. But the question starts to be asked, how many American lives is it going to cost for us to give a final defeat to Japan? And so both sides are doing everything they can to make the other side quit. And you see the reasons there up the top why both are trying to do that. For the Japanese, they have no planes, they've got no fuel, they have no pilots. Remember, they've from day one, basically, they've not been able to replace those things, so they lost them. And so now, because of those things, we completely control the air. and it's open season for us to do whatever we want over the mainland of Japan. And so we start to carry out these bombing raids, and we use incendiary bombs. In other words, bombs that don't just blow up, they hit, and then they're meant to light things on fire in the immediate vicinity. And most Japanese cities were still predominantly built out of wood. And so, I mean, this was horrible for the Japanese people, and it was just, I mean, it was absolutely brutal. And we knew that, and we understood that, and we also understood that the only way that we were going to end this war is to get the Japanese to just stop wanting to fight. And it goes back to, I mean, Civil War, total war. The North did this to the South eventually because the only way to win was to get the other side to want to quit. And so we cut off their supply lines. We completely just made it, and like I said, impossible for the Japanese to have any hope of winning. But again, what happens here gives you a little insight into the mind of the Japanese when it came to this stuff. We keep talking about that kamikaze mentality. This is where kamikaze actually becomes a real thing. They have no pilots. They're running out of planes. They're running out of fuel. Do they give up? Do they quit? Do they surrender? No. They ask guys to hop in a plane and give them enough fuel for a one-way ticket and take their plane and turn into a guided missile and fly into the side of a aircraft carrier or whatever. So, and you would think that that's going to be something that maybe not a bunch of people are going to sign up for. No, the Japanese, I mean, they signed up for it in droves because they didn't want to go home a loser. They were given an opportunity to take out Americans, and so that's what a lot of them did. And so that influenced thinking later on when a decision had to be made. Do we want to invade Japan or do we want to take another route? Okay. Did Americans actually have the stomach for what some people estimated to be 1 million more casualties to invade Japan?
So that brings us to the alternative. What is the alternative to invading the mainland? And that would be dropping the bomb. You guys have all heard of the Manhattan Project. Mr. Denton already talked about FDR has passed and Truman is our president. Now he is going to be left with the decision. We have developed the capability of dropping an atomic bomb. This was a massive project that was taking place under extreme secrecy. Employed a lot of people, cost a lot of money. And the ultimate question, once we developed it, was would it work? If we drop this bomb, we know we have an idea of how much destruction it's going to cause, but will that be enough to get Japan to say, okay, we surrender, we're out of it? It's a big decision to make because this isn't like you're going in and you're dropping a bomb on a military site. When you drop the atomic bomb, the civilian population is what you're going to be decimating, not your military commanders, the people that are responsible for refusing to surrender. It's going to be the civilian population that's going to be decimated. So it's something that, I think weighed heavily on Truman and whether or not to pull the decision. And, ultimately we're going to get to that here.
One of the big what ifs in history is what if the Germans got the bomb first? And it's also one of the big ironies that the people who started the nuclear program and who came to America and pleaded with FDR to get it going were Jewish refugees who'd been forced out of Germany. So it's one of those interesting things to think about. So that question is there. Do we invade Japan? Do we use this ultimate weapon? And so that kamikaze mentality comes out again here. We declare and basically tell the Japanese, surrender or we will destroy you. And then we even went on and We tested the bomb. We showed, we made sure that they knew what it was capable of. They knew we had this weapon. They chose to not surrender. And we started dropping leaflets, which you can see in the picture over there on the right-hand side, telling the people in these cities to go or they will be dead. And so then we follow that up August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. You guys all know the names of these places for the wrong reason, unfortunately. Somewhere between 100 and 150,000 people died there. And, we had a video again. I may try to attach that for you guys. People that, anything within basically, like a mile radius of where the bomb detonates are vaporized instantaneously. I've heard stories. They're still in these places today on the concrete. There are what they call shadows. They left them there where people were basically slammed into the concrete and then they were vaporized and there was nothing left behind except for these shadows. And so then you had the nuclear fallout, you had the concussion of the blast, which reached much farther out. These bombs were just absolutely devastating in ways that are hard to imagine. But hundreds of thousands of people died from one bomb, and the Japanese still didn't surrender. So 3 days later, we drop another one. Okay. Another, somewhere in the vicinity of 50, 60, up to 80,000 more people die in Nagasaki. And finally, the Japanese surrender after that. And that effectively ends the war, which will take us to some statistics here. And you just see some of the, kind of the unbelievable power of these bombs and what they could do. It's unlike anything that had ever been dreamed of before. So there's final results. I'll let Mr. Ansel take this one.
Just numbers wise, you can see how many people that we lost there, approximately 300,000 on the world. Again, these estimates have changed over the years. I think it's on the high end now in terms of they're looking at approximately 80 million of our world population died. You are going to see the creation of the United Nations, which is still around today. Some of your most powerful nations grouped together as kind of a League of Nations 2.0. And as Mr. Denton said earlier in the last set of notes, almost immediately following the conclusion of World War II, you're going to see a new war emerge called the Cold War. And we'll be talking a lot about that next unit or next couple of weeks. But you're going to see the creation of, there's two main countries that are going to be superpowers left, the United States and the Soviet Union. And it's going to be a game of who can get more people on their side. We now have war. War will never be the same. Now that we've shown the capability of dropping a nuclear bomb, you're going to have this arms race between us and the Soviet Union, and then other countries still today are trying to possess that capability. If you've paid attention to the news in the past year or so with Iran, they're still trying to develop theirs, North Korea. So the whole concept of war being what it used to be like is going to be changed following the dropping of the bombs in Japan. Now the question is, where do we go from here? How do we try to make sure that there's not a World War III? And you're going to have two superpowers dueling it out. And I don't know, Mr. Denton, you got anything you want to add to that?
So we always talk about turning points in every war. World War II is a turning point for human history. It was unlike anything that ever had come before, and we've never seen anything like it since. And everything has changed as a result of that. And it will probably be looked back on for as long as people record things as a major shift in everything that we know and the way that we think about things and the way we see things. So can't can't put enough emphasis on what all this stuff means, but everything that we talk about after this is going to be, it's going to play out in a certain way, and then the the waves of what's left after World War II are going to impact everything that we see going forward. Okay. So as always, wish you guys well. Hope you're taking care of yourselves. Let us know if you have any questions, and we will see you guys soon.
See you guys.